We've seen a picture or a video of the event in September 1971 at Hanford, Washington, which the new young chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission was introduced by the president. Do you remember that day in Hanford?
I remember it very well. As a chairman of a regulatory agency, I was kept away from where the president was speaking. So I was in the background. The thing that I remember is I never have seen Nixon as happy and as relaxed as he was that day in Walla Walla. He'd grown up in a town in California that was sort of like Walla Walla. And these were his people. These weren't all these complicated things that you have in urban areas. He was now governing and had to be watched carefully. These were his people, and he totally relaxed, told jokes. It was just a splendid occasion.
In that speech, he talks about nuclear energy, and he makes a joke that that if anybody wants to have it explained to them, they should ask you, although they have to be careful because nobody will understand what you say, or it's so difficult to understand. You dealt with him over many years in many different aspects. What was it like dealing with Richard Nixon? What was his mind like?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the public image of Nixon is not accurate. That he could be very genial and kind. This was not his public persona, but in private he was quite different. He was very candid, sometimes blunt. Even on the occasion that we're discussing here, he was holding, he was during the oil embargo, he was negotiating with the Saudis, and we had already reached agreement. And he said at the cabinet meeting, "I don't know whether we'll ever have an end to this embargo." And I leaned over to him, I said, "Mr. President, we've just reached this." He said, "I know that, but why should I say that here?"
You've put yourself in the position of the historian and questioning what we learn from, actually you actually know what we learn from history. You're fairly decisive in that, which is that we learn nothing.
The only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history, somewhat exaggerated to be sure. Sometimes we learn a great deal of from history that is not right. The Munich Agreement, which everybody talks about still, is brought up continuously, even in circumstances that it's not relevant. The Vietnam era is brought up continuously by a younger generation, despite the fact that much of what happened in Vietnam is not relevant to circumstances today. So we not only learn from history, we mislearn from history.
What, whether we can learn or just draw conclusions from facts, what can we conclude from the facts that Nixon, sort of de novo, had to deal with this new kind of energy crisis, where the whole balance of supply and demand had changed? And as was said in today's forum, most of the menu, the smorgasbord of options for dealing with the energy crisis were set out, were defined by Nixon's domestic counsel and presented by Nixon in dozens of speeches and statements from 71 to 74.
The interesting thing was that it was in 71, which was 2 years before the Arab oil embargo, that he began to lay out this menu.
At the beginning, in his first week after his inauguration, President Obama said that presidents for going on 40 years have been dealing with this problem, and he cites Nixon as the first one, president since Richard Nixon. have declared energy independence. And I think President Obama says that through through partisan politics, through the lack of public focus, the public just doesn't focus on the subject or doesn't understand it. Is there any hope for America or the world and energy, given that for 40 years we've sort of been reinventing the wheel that Nixon invented from 71 to 74?
Well, what President Obama did not acknowledge is that it's an intractable problem. Oil is maldistributed around the world. We are dependent on oil. And as long as we are dependent on oil, it doesn't matter how much nuclear power that we produce or coal-fired plants.
Will the sun or the wind be our salvation, sooner or later, or at all?
Well, it is possible that someday they will become more cost-effective. But at the moment, neither of them is cost-effective. Wind power is being deployed, but because of large subsidies by the taxpayer, such that we could not afford to move over to dependency on these non-cost-effective capabilities. For the moment, we are going to continue to depend on fossil fuels, including petroleum.
Would you take a stab at defining the Nixon legacy in the area of energy or any other area that...
Well, of course, energy and environment intersect. And if you go back to the early days, Nixon, although he never would acknowledge it, never would brag about it, was one of our great environmental presidents. Under him, we had the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, we had the National Environmental Policy Act, and we had the creation, under his reorganization plan number 1, of the Environmental Policy Agency. And the reality is that environment and energy intersect. To the extent that you use fossil fuels, you may be creating problems. And you certainly have been creating many problems over the years with regard to sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides. Under the administration's handling of it, we have had a colossal collapse of sulfur oxides in the world and of nitrogen oxides, such that we rarely have the same kind of smog conditions that we had when Nixon entered the White House. And that is this intersection between energy and the environment. With regard to energy, some of the things that he tried to achieve just didn't work out, like the coal conversion program, or for that matter, his R&D program with regard to gasification of coal and liquefaction of coal. They are likely to come again someday.
No good deed goes unpunished, and just as he sent the first environmental message to Congress in 70 and the first energy message in 71, wasn't he, as he tried to deal with the energy crisis, wasn't he constrained by some of the environmental regulations that he'd already signed in to law? Because one of the things he had to do, or several of the things he had to do, was ask for the suspension of some of those environmental regulations, and particularly with the chairman of the relevant Senate committee, Scoop Jackson, he was up against a staunch environmentalist.
Well, the real staunch environmentalist was Senator Muskie, who became a candidate in 1972. And I don't think Jackson was as dedicated on these issues as was Muskie. However, Jackson always leaned towards the energy side of the issue rather than toward the environmental side. Muskie leaned toward the environmental side. I don't think that those were real constraints. The real constraints have come in the last decade or so, as we have talked about the possibility that greenhouse gases contribute to global warming. And that means a flat-out contradiction between the use of fossil fuels and the preservation of the environment as seen by environmentalists.
Looking from the White House or from the executive branch as you did, who were the particular friends of Nixonian energy in Congress?
You've got to ask somebody else. I was not in the, let me start again. Since Nixon was an advocate of nuclear power, he had on his side all of the members of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, starting with Chet Hollifield, who was chairman. In other areas, he did not have that much support, partly because of the great division that we had in this country between the consuming states and the producing states. And whatever satisfied the producing states was bound to lose in votes in the consuming states and vice versa. So you had built-in oppositions. You also had built-in support when he attempted to loosen the controls on natural gas, which had been imposed by the Supreme Court back there in an earlier period. He had total support from Sam Rayburn, who was Speaker of the House, from Lyndon Johnson and others, and he had total opposition from Northern Democrats.
On an unrelated topic, earlier I heard you say that you remember the 1933 FDR inauguration. What do you remember about that?
Well, I was 4 years old.
Oh, so it's a precocious memory.
The fact of well, actually, I was 3 years old, but we had this big tube in our family in which you had a megaphone like the dog that
oh yes,
was
the Nipper and
in the RCA ads, yeah. And the announcer, I can remember it now, he said, "What we have seen is a return of the southern states to solid Democratic support. They are all supporting Roosevelt. Roosevelt is being elected." And of course, in 1928, many of the southern states had broken because a Democratic candidate was Al Smith, a Catholic. And that was all that I could remember, but I remember it.
For a 3-4-year-old, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.